Okay, this is part two of the video for week three, where we are continuing our discussion of voting. And what I'd like to do in this section is go into a little bit of the historical realities of voting and the right to vote, and then finish up by talking about access to the polls, access to voting, and some of the issues that are floating along presently in society. All right, the Civil War was probably the greatest traumatic political, social happening within the country during its entire creation, from the time of the American Revolution to now. At the end of the Civil War, General Lee had surrendered, the Army of Virginia had surrendered, the Union troops under Abraham Lincoln were victorious. The North had been largely left untouched. The Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania was Lee's one big attempt to move an army into the northern states to inflict the destruction and casualties on the North that were being inflicted across the South at that point in time. And the Battle of Gettysburg, long and bloody, one of the most horrible battles ever fought by Americans anywhere, ended up basically in a draw. Both armies were so severely damaged they had to withdraw, and Lee was never able to gather enough troops or supplies again to consider invading the North. So we have a northern set of states where the economy is booming because of war production, where the Industrial Revolution has taken off and cities are growing. The manufacture of items is being largely mechanized and now done in factories as opposed by hand in small shops. Railroads stretch back and forth across all the northern states. And in contrast, you had a South which was now thoroughly defeated, much in ruins, its economy in shambles, its social life in shambles, and really with very little direction as to what was going to happen next. And in the midst of the South was a population of millions of people who had been newly freed from slavery, without money, without land, without education, without a means to support themselves. And it became critically important as to how do we deal with this situation. First and foremost, Lincoln was very quick. He had pronounced the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in any territory occupied by federal troops, but it did not free slaves in the border states that had remained in the Union but yet still had legal slavery. And it really left the question up in the air as to what's going to happen with slavery once the war is over. While he was still alive before his assassination, pushed very long and very hard to make sure that the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery totally, completely, and absolutely in the United States or any of its territories, would be passed, would become part of the basic constitutional structure of the country, and that at least that horror would be done and over with forever. Of course, Lincoln was assassinated. He never lived to see the 13th Amendment enacted, although it was. And he did not live long enough to supervise how we were going to rebuild the southern states and reintegrate them into the country and the economy and the society as a whole, nor to see how we would work in terms of dealing with the populations of people who now were left basically homeless and defenseless, as having been freed from their masters, but really given no place to go and nothing to do. For better or worse, probably for worse, Lincoln had chosen Andrew Johnson to run with him as a vice president. The reason Lincoln did this was Andrew Johnson was someone called a loyal Democrat. He was from the state of Tennessee, I believe, which was a border state. Johnson, it was a slaveholding state, but it did not want to leave the Union. And there were many people in Tennessee who wanted to remain in the Union. There were a number of battles fought in Tennessee to determine its status. But Johnson was one of the few Southern senators who did not leave the Congress, remained in Congress, and even though he was pro-slavery, was also pro-union and wanted to see the country reunited. Lincoln's popularity was questionable as he was running for election, and so he picked Johnson as a running mate to help gather the votes in those border states where there were still many Democrats, many people who were still undecided about slavery, undecided about the split up of the country, and Lincoln wanted to show them that he could work with them and that they could come to some compromise about this. Now, the interesting thing you guys have to realize that is that Lincoln was a Republican, and once the southern states left Congress, they took their representatives and senators home, the Republican Party was in control of Congress, and it was the Republican Party, which was the anti-slavery, pro-union party, which basically organized the war to end slavery and to make sure that the United States remained united. So, interesting reality. The Republican Party of that day was somewhat different from the way people view the Republican Party today. Now, Andrew Johnson, being basically a Southerner, having many sympathies towards the Southerners, wanted to go very easy in terms of readmitting the states to the Union, allowing the prior people who had been in power to remain in power, and to basically allow things, absent the existence of slavery, to move into a kind of status quo to move back to how things had been prior to the war. In trying to enact some of these policies, he little by little enraged the Republican Congress. The southern states, the legislatures, began to enact laws called black codes. And what these codes were, they were really a presaging or a preview of what would become the Jim Crow apartheid laws later on in the century, but they were specifically aimed at the newly freed slaves to prevent blacks and people of African ancestry from being able to become involved in politics, from being able to become involved in running and controlling the economy, from being able to enter into social life on an equal basis with the southern whites. Andrew Johnson was at least neutral towards these, did nothing to speak against them or stop them. And again, the Republicans in Congress reached a point very quickly where they had enough. They attempted to impeach Johnson, and he was impeached by the House. And in the Senate, he retained the presidency by only one vote. So his unpopularity was very clear, and at this point, the Republicans in Congress picked up the reins and did a number of things. In 1867, they passed over Johnson's veto something called the Reconstruction Act. Reconstruction was the name to be given for the process to bring the southern states back into the country. While this was going on, they divided the southern states into 5 military districts, each of which was to be governed by a military commander appointed by the Department of Defense, and was to have all power and control in the district during that time. They put down all kinds of rules and regulations. They allowed blacks to vote, at least black men to vote. And during this period, very interestingly, a number of legislatures in the South had many black members. Some of them even had black majorities. The state of Mississippi sent 2 black senators to Washington. So this process was beginning to work, beginning to take hold. As part of Reconstruction, in order for a state to be granted full rights and to become part of the Union again, they had to do a number of things. They had to adopt universal male suffrage, so there could be no distinction between former slave and freeman, between white or black, as a result of your religion, whatever. Every free man in the state, every male citizen of age had to be given the right to vote. They had to adopt and vote to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment we talked about ended slavery. The 14th Amendment did a very interesting thing. First and foremost, it said that every citizen of every state was first and foremost a United States citizen. This had never been clear before the Civil War, and of course it was one of the reasons that when the war came, many people who did not want to see the country split up, who were not particularly in favor of slavery, still fought on the side of the South because in their minds they were fighting for their states, because their true citizenship, their true origins, their true loyalty was not with this government off in Washington far away and not having too much direct power over them at that time, but it was with their state, with the people they had grown up with, who were their relatives and ancestors. And so for the first time, the 14th Amendment makes it absolutely clear that as a citizen of a state, you are first and foremost a citizen of the United States. It also then goes on to say that no state may violate the rights of a citizen of the United States, but must give every citizen equal protection of the law and due process of the law. Coming along somewhat later was the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed, again, every male citizen the right to vote, regardless of race, ethnic origin, religion, or creed. The southern states, by 1870, all of them had met these requirements. They were all readmitted in whole or in part to the Union. And the Republicans began to become tired of all this, and they began to retreat from their very strict views. In 1874, the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives, so the Republicans were no longer in control. Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican, had become president in 1869. By this time, the southern states had begun moving again to come up with ideas to keep the freed slaves from voting and from having full political rights, and Ulysses S. Grant was not particularly interested in fighting for these or speaking out against them, even though he was a Republican. And certainly by the time 1874 came along and the Democrats controlled Congress, that became beyond the reach of the president to really affect, because the Democrats in Congress would not allow the president to impose further penalties or restrictions on the southern states. Finally, in 1876, there was a contested presidential election, and in order to get the Democrats to stop their challenges, the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes, who became president, agreed that he would take steps and he would ratify, he would vote for any vote in Congress to end Reconstruction. So by 1876, 11 years after the end of the war, Reconstruction had ended. The southern states were now free to maintain their political systems, their legislatures, vote in their laws. And regardless of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the southern states began a dramatic campaign to again ensure that control by the former white folks who had been in charge prior to the Civil War would be restored and maintained. They enacted all kinds of restrictions on voting, which were not specifically aimed at race, religion, or creed, or ethnic origin. However, one of the things they imposed was a poll tax, so you actually had to pay tax to vote. The majority of the newly freed slaves were piteously poor. They barely could feed and clothe and house themselves, so the idea to pay to go vote into an election was just something that was inconceivable. It couldn't happen. They had no ability to do it. Secondly, they imposed literacy tests. And again, the vast majority of the people who had been held as slaves were never afforded any type of education at all. They were largely illiterate. So when it came time to try to register to vote, they could not pass the literacy tests. To make matters even worse, they passed things such as something called the grandfather rule. With the grandfather rule, if you could prove that you had a grandfather who before the war had been entitled to vote, then you became entitled to vote and you didn't have to pay the poll tax and you didn't have to pass the literacy test. So that while they were disenfranchising, which is a word for meaning take away the right or the power to vote, if you have the franchise, you have the right to vote. If you're disenfranchised, the right to vote has been taken away. They were disenfranchising all the newly freed slaves because none of their grandparents had the right to vote. They were all slaves. It was illegal for them to even attempt to try and register to vote. So in effect, what happened is, while all the newly freed slaves were prevented from voting, all the Southerners, white Southerners, were allowed to vote, even those who were poor or illiterate, because if they could prove that a grandparent had voted, been registered to vote, then the rules were waived for them. In addition to this, this is a period where we saw the rise of violence, of lynchings, of burnings of houses, all types of things done to the newly freed blacks to prevent them from trying to exercise any kind of political, social, or economic power. There were many vigilante groups that arose, the most prominent of these being the Ku Klux Klan, which basically utilized terrorism and violence to ensure that the blacks would not participate in the system and would remain as second-class citizens. The states, again, began to reenact these black codes. They began to enact laws to segregate the races, to make sure that in all types of public situations, the races could not mingle together. One of these laws having to do with riding on a railroad train came up in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which we talked about a little bit last week. In Plessy, as we had said, the state of Louisiana had passed a law saying that on trains there had to be separate accommodations for blacks and whites. Mr. Plessy, a wealthy black New Orleans businessman, bought a first-class train ticket to go to Baton Rouge and was told politely by the conductor that he would have to go back to the third-class car because that was the only car where blacks were allowed to be under the new segregation laws. He fought his case all the way to the Supreme Court, and in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court basically said that separate but equal is fine, that there is some kind of rational reality to separating the races. It's part of the police powers of the states, and if that's what they choose to do, how they choose to organize their societies, God bless them. We, as the federal judiciary and the federal government, have no power to stop them from doing that. Well, of course, this just opened the doors, and very quickly, an entire system of apartheid, of separation of the races, was enacted across the South, and even to a certain extent in some of the northern cities where there were large black populations. The school districts were segregated, and basically the system came into being that rolled right through into the 1960s of separate facilities for blacks and whites and all kinds of things, in restaurants, hotels, riding in trains, on buses, in schools, in stores, that it was perfectly illegal, and not only legal, but one of the insidious things about these laws is that they didn't just say that, well, whites that want to separate have the right to be separate. They mandated that all whites and blacks must be separated. They even went so far as there were laws called miscegenation laws. Miscegenation is a concept that basically means marriage between people of two different races. And in many of the southern states, this was actually illegal for a black to marry a white or a white to marry a black. Such marriages were not legally recognized. And the children from such marriages would not be recognized as legitimate. So the system became profound, pronounced, and incredibly cumbersome and burdensome, and it basically remained that way until 1954 when Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy and said that segregation in public schools is inherently unfair, inherently illegal, and that began a march towards civil rights that we saw develop in the 1960s under Martin Luther King and many of the other black leaders that came to rise to prominence, and that eventually in 1964 and 65 ended up with the enactment of the Civil Rights Acts that allowed, again, for the first time, blacks to participate as full citizens, in which used the constitutional authority given to Congress in the 14th and 15th Amendments to enforce the civil rights of blacks, even against their own state governments. Part of this was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made poll taxes and literacy tests illegal in federal elections, and again was passed by Congress even the Supreme Court was a little bit slow to pick up on these issues, as late as 1959. They were saying that poll taxes and literacy taxes were not per se unconstitutional, as long as you could prove they weren't aimed totally at prohibiting a certain race from voting. Several amendments to the Constitution were passed during this time period. Certainly, the 15th Amendment was passed, guaranteeing the right to vote, regardless of race, religion, ethnic origin, and creed. It was largely ignored until the 20th century. The 21st Amendment, passed in 1920, extended the franchise to people of both sexes. So for the first time, women in every state were allowed to vote and to run for office on equal parity with men. A number of states had come to this position before 1920, and there certainly were vast movements, the suffragette movement among women, to gain the right to vote, but it took this amendment to finally bring it to be. In 1933, Congress voted to set the congressional term beginning in the 20th Amendment will begin on January 3rd each year. Each odd number year after the election, an even number year. And the term of president shall begin every fourth year on January 20th at noon. So for the first time, we have a really clear date. Prior to that, the presidents really didn't take office until March of the next year. So there was an extremely long period between the election and the swearing in of the new president under our standards. That came to be called the lame duck period, on the idea that a lame duck can't really fly or maneuver or do anything, and that whoever had been president was not going to be president come the end of March really had lost most of their power and had to sit there for almost 5 months twiddling their thumbs and really having no ability to control or to participate in what was going on. So the 20th Amendment sought to end that by putting the new president into office in January. The 24th Amendment made an absolute amendment to reinforce the law passed by Congress that no poll tax shall be imposed in any federal election. And finally, the 26th, that's not 20. Can't be, maybe it is the 26th Amendment. I'm sorry. The 26th Amendment gave every citizen over the age of 18 the right to vote. That was only passed in 1971, and that was in response to the protests that broke out during the Vietnam War, where legally at that point in time, an 18-year-old could be drafted and 5 weeks later be fighting for his life in the rice paddies of Vietnam, but was not legally able to have had a beer or to vote for the people that were sending him to fight this war. And the protests became large enough, violent enough, and politically threatening enough that very quickly Congress proposed and the states adopted this amendment to the Constitution that gave the vote to anyone who had reached their 18th birthday.